In May of 2009, the quiet suburb of Columbia, Illinois became the center of a tragedy that would shake the community to its core. 3 innocent lives were stolen in their own home, a place that should have been their sanctuary. What appeared at first to be the work of a deranged stalker slowly unraveled into something far more sinister, something that no one could have imagined. After weeks of painstaking investigation, detectives uncovered a truth so dark it would leave a nation asking, how could someone do this to their own family? This is the story of the Coleman family murders. You're watching True Crime Wound, where we dig deep into cases that demand justice and remembrance. If you're passionate about uncovering the truth behind these tragedies, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Like this video, leave your thoughts in the comments and share it with others who believe these stories need to be told. Now, let's dive into today's case. Sheri Coleman was born with a gentle spirit and a heart full of love. Growing up in a close-knit family, she was known for her kindness, her unwavering faith, and her dedication to those she cared about. Friends described her as the kind of person who would drop everything to help someone in need. Sheri met Chris Coleman in their younger years, and their relationship seemed like a fairy tale. Chris was charismatic, driven, and deeply religious. He spoke passionately about his faith and his desire to serve God in meaningful ways. To Sheri, he seemed like the perfect partner, someone who shared her values and her vision for a faith-centered family life. The couple married and built what appeared to be an ideal life together. Chris eventually landed a prestigious position as chief of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, one of the largest and most influential Christian organizations in the country. The job came with respect, responsibility, and a 6-figure salary of $100,000 a year. It was a position that required trust, integrity, and an impeccable moral character. Chris traveled with Joyce Meyer herself, protecting her during conferences and events around the world. When she became a mother to 2 beautiful boys, Garrett and Gavin, Sheri poured her entire heart into motherhood. She was the kind of mother who attended every school event, who made sure her boys felt loved and supported every single day. She volunteered at their school, organized play dates, and created a home environment that felt safe and nurturing. Her friends often marveled at how she balanced everything with such grace: her role as a mother, her support of her husband's career, and her own personal faith journey. From the outside, the Colemans looked like the perfect family. They attended church regularly, lived in a beautiful home in Columbia, Illinois, and seemed devoted to one another. Chris was seen as a pillar of the community, a man of faith who had dedicated his life to protecting one of Christianity's most prominent voices. But behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to form. There were tensions that few people saw: financial pressures, despite the substantial income, long absences due to Chris's demanding travel schedule, and something else, something darker, that was lurking beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect marriage. What nobody knew was that Chris Coleman was living a double life. In the months before May 2009, strange things began happening at the Coleman household. The family started receiving threatening emails and messages. The language was disturbing: violent threats directed at Sheri and the boys, warnings that something terrible would happen if Chris didn't leave his job at Joyce Meyer Ministries. The messages were terrifying. They spoke of punishment, of watching the family, of making them pay. Chris reported these threats to his employer and to local police. He expressed concern for his family's safety, painting a picture of a family under siege by an unknown stalker with a vendetta against either him or the ministry. Joyce Meyer Ministries took the threats seriously. Security measures were discussed. The situation created tension and fear. But Chris continued his work, traveling for ministry events, while Sheri stayed home with the boys, increasingly anxious about their safety. On the night of May 4th, 2009, the Coleman home in Columbia, Illinois settled into what should have been an ordinary evening. Sheri Coleman tucked her sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, into their rooms. The boys likely drifted off, talking about school, friends, video games, and the small joys that fill a child's world. Sheri soon settled in for the night herself, perhaps watching television or preparing for the next day, unaware that she and her sons had only hours left to live. The morning of May 5th, 2009 began quietly in the neighborhood, but inside the Coleman home, something was terribly wrong. According to Chris Coleman's later statements to police, he had left the house early that morning to go to the gym, as part of his usual routine. Before leaving, he claimed he spoke briefly with Sheri about the threatening emails the family had been receiving, reminding her to keep the doors locked and stay alert. A few hours later, Chris said he became worried when he couldn't reach Sheri or the boys. From the gym, he contacted a neighbor and a co-worker, asking them to check on his home. When they arrived, something immediately felt off. The front door was unlocked. They stepped inside cautiously, calling out for Sheri and the kids. No answer, only a chilling, unnatural silence. Then they saw it. Red spray paint covered the walls. Angry words scrawled across the home. Punished. You have paid. I am always watching. Moments later, they made the horrifying discovery. Sheri was found lifeless in the bedroom. Garrett and Gavin were each found in their own rooms. All three had been strangled, killed by ligature. The scene showed unmistakable signs of a brutal and desperate fight for breath. Emergency personnel rushed in, but it was already far too late. Sheri, 31, Garrett, 11, and Gavin, 9, were pronounced dead. The home that once echoed with laughter had become a devastating crime scene. When Columbia police arrived, the spray-painted messages and the earlier threats initially pushed investigators toward the possibility of a hate crime or stalking incident. It appeared to match the disturbing emails Chris Coleman had been reporting for months, warnings that someone was targeting him and his family. But in the coming days, detectives would uncover that nothing was as it seemed. The working theory was straightforward. An obsessed stalker, possibly someone with a grudge against Joyce Meyer Ministries or against Chris Coleman personally, had made good on their threats. The emails, the warnings, the explicit threats of violence, all of it seemed to point to an external threat that had finally struck. The media picked up the story quickly. A respected security professional working for one of America's most prominent Christian ministries had lost his entire family to a brutal killer. News outlets reported on the threatening emails, the spray-painted messages, and the seemingly random violence. Chris Coleman appeared on camera, grief-stricken, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The community rallied around him. Members of Joyce Meyer Ministries expressed their shock and sorrow. Prayer vigils were held for Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin. Chris was portrayed as a devastated husband and father, a man whose worst fears had come true despite his best efforts to protect his family. But even as the investigation began, some detectives were noticing things that didn't quite add up. As investigators combed through the Coleman home, searching for evidence that would lead them to the killer, they began to notice inconsistencies, small details that didn't fit the narrative of a random stalker attack. Investigators had previously set up quiet surveillance around the Coleman home after Chris began reporting that a stalker was threatening his family. A discreet camera, placed with the help of a neighbor, captured the front of the house day and night, monitoring for anyone who might be watching or approaching the property. But when detectives reviewed the footage, the results were striking. There was no stalker, no unknown visitors, no suspicious movement. Nothing. Not even during the early morning hours when Chris claimed he left the house for the gym on the day of the murders. The surveillance revealed something investigators could no longer ignore. Every threat seemed to exist only when Chris said it did. And slowly the focus of the investigation began to shift, from a supposed stalker to Chris Coleman himself. The spray-painted messages seemed staged. They were dramatic, certainly, but something about them felt performative rather than authentic. Investigators had seen real crime scenes involving rage and obsession, and this didn't quite match the pattern. Then there was Chris Coleman's behavior. While grief manifests differently in everyone, some of his reactions seemed off to trained investigators. His timeline of events had inconsistencies. His emotional responses sometimes seemed rehearsed, and when questioned about certain details, his answers didn't always align with the evidence. Detectives began to look deeper into the threatening emails that had been sent in the months before the murders. Where had they originated? Who had access to send them? And why had they been so specific in their threats without ever escalating to actual contact before the murders? What they discovered would change everything. The breakthrough in the case came from digital forensics and good old-fashioned detective work. Investigators traced the threatening emails that Chris Coleman had been receiving, the ones that supposedly came from an obsessed stalker, and made a stunning discovery. The emails had been sent from Chris Coleman's own laptop. Let that sink in. The threats against his own family, the messages that created the entire narrative of a stalker targeting the Colemans, had been authored by Chris himself. He had created the fiction of an external threat, building a false trail of evidence that he hoped would provide cover for what he was planning. But the digital evidence didn't stop there. Phone records revealed a pattern of communication that Chris had been desperately trying to hide. Text messages, deleted but recovered. Call logs showing contact with someone outside his marriage. GPS data placing him in locations he had claimed not to be. The most damning piece of physical evidence was the spray paint itself. A handwriting expert analyzed the messages scrawled on the walls of the Coleman home. The words meant to look like the work of a deranged stalker. The expert's conclusion was clear. The handwriting matched Chris Coleman's. He had staged the entire scene. The threatening messages, the appearance of a break-in, the dramatic spray-painted warnings. All of it had been a performance designed to point investigators away from the truth. As the investigation deepened, the picture of Chris Coleman's secret life came into sharp focus. And at the center of it all was a woman named Tara Lintz, a longtime friend of Sheri Coleman's. The affair between Chris and Tara had been going on for months, possibly longer. While Chris traveled for work, while Sheri raised their children and maintained their home, Chris was carrying on a relationship that betrayed everything his family stood for. The man who worked for a Christian ministry, who spoke about faith and values, was living a lie. Text messages recovered from phones told the story. Chris and Tara had been discussing a future together, a future that didn't include Sheri and the boys. There were messages about love, about being together, about waiting for the right time. Hotel receipts confirmed their meetings. Surveillance footage from various locations showed them together while Chris was supposedly on ministry business. But there was a problem, a massive, insurmountable problem for Chris Coleman. Joyce Meyer Ministries had a strict moral code for its employees. Any hint of infidelity, especially from someone in a high-profile position like head of security, would result in immediate termination. Chris stood to lose his six-figure salary, his reputation, his standing in the community, and his livelihood if the affair became public. And there was more. Sheri would never agree to a divorce that would destroy the family she had worked so hard to build. She believed in the sanctity of marriage, in working through problems, in honoring commitments. A divorce would also mean splitting assets, paying child support, losing the life he had built. In Chris Coleman's twisted logic, murder seemed like the solution. But there was another factor investigators discovered: financial motive. With Sheri dead, Chris would be the beneficiary of her life insurance. He could maintain his job, at least initially, before the truth came out, and he could start a new life with Tara without the complications of divorce. The betrayal was complete. Chris Coleman had decided that his wife and children, the family who loved him unconditionally, were obstacles to be eliminated. While Chris Coleman appeared to have acted alone in the actual murders, the investigation revealed the extent of his planning and deception. The emails he had sent to himself had been crafted over months, building a paper trail that would supposedly exonerate him when the time came. He had carefully considered his alibi, making sure he was away from home when the murders occurred. He had created a timeline that he believed would be impossible to break. He had even recruited others unknowingly into his scheme by reporting the threats and expressing fear for his family's safety. The relationship with Tara Lynch became a crucial piece of evidence. While she was not charged with any crime related to the murders, her communications with Chris helped establish motive. The messages showed his desperation to be with her, his frustration with his current life, and his willingness to do whatever it took to escape his marriage. Investigators also discovered that Chris had researched various methods and means in the weeks before the murders. Computer forensic analysis revealed search histories, deleted files, and digital footprints that painted a picture of a man planning something terrible. The prosecution would later lay out a clear and compelling motive at trial. Chris Coleman wanted out of his marriage, but he couldn't afford the consequences of divorce. His affair with Tara Lynch had become serious, and he wanted a future with her. But leaving Sheri would mean losing his prestigious, high-paying job at Joyce Meyer Ministries. It would mean financial ruin through divorce proceedings. It would mean losing the respect and standing he had in the community. Murder, in his calculation, solved all of these problems. With Sheri and the boys gone, he could claim to be a grieving widower and father. He could collect on life insurance policies. He could maintain his position at the ministry, at least until the truth emerged. And eventually, after a respectful period of mourning, he could begin a new life with Tara. The threats he had manufactured would provide the perfect cover story. The staged crime scene would point investigators toward a fictional stalker, and his alibi of being away from home would put him in the clear. It was a plan born of supreme arrogance and complete moral bankruptcy. Chris Coleman had convinced himself that he was smart enough to get away with murdering his own family. He was wrong. On May 19, 2009, just 2 weeks after the murders, Chris Coleman was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest came after investigators had gathered overwhelming evidence of his guilt. During interrogations, Chris maintained his innocence, sticking to his story about the stalker and the threats. He denied the affair with Tara Lynch initially, then admitted to it but claimed it had nothing to do with the murders. He insisted he loved his family and would never harm them. But the evidence told a different story. Confronted with the digital forensics showing he had sent the threatening emails to himself, Chris had no adequate explanation. Shown the handwriting analysis of the spray-painted messages, he denied it was his writing despite expert testimony to the contrary. Presented with the timeline that placed him in a position to commit the murders, despite his supposed alibi, he couldn't account for the discrepancies. Throughout the interrogations, Chris cycled through denial, minimization, and attempts to redirect blame. He cried at times, proclaiming his innocence and his love for his dead family. But to the experienced detectives questioning him, his emotional displays seemed calculated, his tears performative. The man who had spent months planning what he thought was the perfect crime was falling apart under the weight of evidence he hadn't anticipated investigators would find. Chris Coleman's trial began in April 2011, nearly 2 years after the murders of Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin. The prosecution presented a methodical case, building piece by piece to show that Chris had planned and executed the murders of his own family. They presented the digital evidence showing Chris had sent the threatening emails to himself. They brought in the handwriting expert who testified that the spray-painted messages matched Chris's handwriting. They showed the timeline of his affair with Tara Lintz and his motive to escape his marriage without losing his job and financial security. Text messages between Chris and Tara were read in court, showing his desire to be with her and his frustration with his current life. Phone records and GPS data contradicted parts of his alibi, and forensic evidence from the crime scene pointed consistently towards someone who had intimate knowledge of the home and access to it, not a random stalker. The defense tried to maintain that the evidence was circumstantial, that the police had rushed to judgment, and that Chris was a grieving father being wrongly accused. But the sheer volume of evidence was overwhelming. After deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced Chris Coleman to 3 consecutive life sentences, one for each member of his family he had brutally taken from this world. In his remarks, the judge spoke about the particularly heinous nature of the crimes, that Chris had murdered not just his wife, but his own children, boys who trusted him completely. There would be no possibility of parole. Chris Coleman would spend the rest of his life in prison. In 2015, an appellate court reviewed the case and upheld the convictions, finding no error in the trial proceedings. The verdict was final. Outside the courthouse, Sheri's family spoke through tears about the verdict. They expressed relief that justice had been served, but also profound grief that no amount of justice could bring Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin back. They spoke about the beautiful souls that had been lost, a loving mother and 2 innocent children whose only crime was being in the way of a selfish man's desires. "Sheri was the kindest person I knew," one family member said. "She loved with her whole heart. And those boys, they were her world. The fact that the person who did this was the one who was supposed to protect them, it's something we'll never fully understand." The community of Columbia, Illinois, was devastated. Neighbors who had lived near the Colemans spoke about the shock of discovering that the threat hadn't come from outside, but from within their own home. The very person who should have been their protector had become their executioner. Joyce Meyer Ministries issued statements expressing their horror at the crimes and their support for Sheri's family. The organization had been dragged into a tragedy that contradicted everything it stood for: faith, family, and integrity. Chris Coleman had betrayed not just his family, but everyone who had trusted him. Friends of Sheri and the boys created memorials, held vigils, and established scholarships in their names. They were determined that Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin would be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived, with love, joy, and innocence. The Coleman family murders stand as one of the most heartbreaking examples of betrayal in modern true crime. 3 innocent lives were stolen not by a stranger, not by some random act of violence, but by the person who was supposed to love and protect them above all others. Sheri Coleman built a life on faith, love, and devotion. She poured everything into her family, believing in the sanctity of the bonds she had created. Garrett and Gavin were children full of promise, with their whole lives ahead of them. They trusted their father completely, never suspecting that he was capable of such evil. This reminds us why we tell these stories, because Sheri, Garrett, and Gavin deserved better. They deserved to live full lives, to see sunrises and celebrate birthdays and achieve their dreams. They deserved to be more than victims. And by remembering them, by refusing to let their story be forgotten, we honor their memories, and we affirm that their lives mattered. Chris Coleman took everything from them in the most cowardly way imaginable, but he could not take away the love they shared, the joy they brought to others, or the memory of who they were before tragedy struck. Rest in peace, Sheri Coleman.